I'm really excited to do this webinar. So if it's your first event ever, again, my name is Lee. I'll introduce myself a little bit more in just a moment. But for the rest of you who've been coming to these, welcome back. So this is a monthly series of webinars that I've been doing with Plume all the way since, I think, August, right? And this is one that I've been wanting to do from the very beginning because it's a topic that's very, very near and dear to my heart. And I'll say there is way more here than we're going to be able to cover, right? This is a huge topic, right? So we're going to scratch a couple of surfaces, and then during Q&A, and especially during the after party social space, we can get more into nitty-gritty of various things. But that all said, the topic is trans love and intimacy, right? Subtitled Exploring Sexual, Romantic, and Platonic Relationships, and a bunch of other kinds too. Because it turns out those categories are not neat and tidy, nor do they exhaust all of the possibilities. Right? So let's get into it. I'll tell you a little bit about me. That's me. So I'm Lee, and I do a couple of things. So aside from being an educator here at Plume and a peer facilitator here at Plume, I'm also an instructor. I teach philosophy at New Mexico State University. I am also the dialectical programming coordinator for a group in Pennsylvania called Growth Through Change. So it's a dialectical behavior therapy practice that is neuro-inclusive, that is sort of queer affirming, and I help with that. I'm also the founder of Transcendence Coaching, which is my own personal practice. What that is it is a queer-centered, non-monogamy informed, kink informed coaching and consulting practice run as much as is possible on anti-capitalist principles. So I'll give you my contact information at the end. If that's anything you'd ever be interested in chatting more about, you'll know how to reach me. So that's a little bit about what I do in my day-to-day. I'll tell you a little bit about what I've done. So I do have a PhD in philosophy from, shout out to my Ohio friends, from The Ohio State University. And in addition to that, I'm a certified sexuality counselor, certified through the Sexual Health Alliance, where I used to be their LGBTQI plus curriculum coordinator. And I have and will again be the co-facilitator with my friend Midori of their kink informed certification program. Beyond that, I have been certified as a mindfulness instructor through the Mindfulness Institute for Emerging Adults, and I'm certified as a philosophical consultant through the National Philosophical Counseling Association. Philosophical consulting, think of it as kind of like DBT or CBT, but not clinical, more on existential stuff and different sort of question asking. So not exactly like DBT or CBT at all. Now, in terms of the perspectives I bring to the table, the lived experience, the identities, I'll share a little bit about myself because these things are going to inform all of the thoughts that I bring to you today. And I think it's good to acknowledge that. So in terms of gender, I do identify as a non-binary trans feminine person. Sometimes I'll say trans woman. And, oftentimes I don't feel the need to distinguish in my experience. In terms of my orientation, I am both aromantic and asexual, but also sapphically oriented, which is to say romance and romantic attraction and sex and sexual attraction don't play much of a role in how I understand myself and relate to other people and move through the world. But I am attracted to feminine presenting individuals and feminine identified individuals and do pursue relationships. More on how that can work in a little bit. In terms of my relationship style, I do identify as a relationship anarchist, which is not quite a form of polyamory, though it is a form of non-monogamy. To anyone in the room who might celebrate polyamory, happy belated Polyamory Day, which was just recently. I am autistic and I do have ADHD, member of the neurodivergent community. I always say in my experience, I don't like the term ADHD because, maybe you relate. Both of the Ds feel a little inaccurate to me. My attention does not have a deficit. I do not have a deficit of attention. And while I would say that it is at times quite disabling, I don't think it's anything disordered about me. And then at the very bottom there, I think there's an important one to note. While I am queer, while I am trans, while I am neurodivergent, more fundamentally than any of those things, I am white. And that informs everything I bring to the table, right? So while I am trans, I experience a white version of transness. While I am neurodivergent, I experience a white version of neurodivergence. And I think it's best to name that because it's going to be a factor in my presentation one way or another, and better to name it rather than ignore it. I see a question already in the chat. Why are there a lot of us who are autistic or ADHD? Great question. My webinar last month was actually on that topic or related. It was on trans experience and neurodivergence. And I think if you poke around on Plume in some places, you should be able to find it. If not, email me with the contact info that I send at the end, and I can send you a link to it. Okay, so that's a little bit about what I do, what I've done, who I am, and what I bring to the table. Enough about me, though, so let's go into the material. Here's the agenda for tonight. I really want to talk about 5 topics with you. Right? They're pretty broad, but I want to talk about this notion of love, sex, and transition and how these 3 things connect and sort of influence each other. I want to talk about this, like, we might describe it as trans dating, or we might describe it as dating while trans. I want to dive into the project, or at least open the door toward this concept of redefining intimacy. I want to explore a little bit about this idea of relationship styles. And at the end, I want to reflect a little bit about building the connections you want. Right? Now, a lot of this, again, is going to be very broad brushstrokes because I'm trying to speak to a lot of experiences at once here. But we'll have time at the end to refine a little bit and hone in on specific questions. So let's go. We'll start with this topic of love, sex, and transition. I'll share with you all a little bit about my experience here. Maybe you'll relate to some of it. I knew I was trans a long time before I started transitioning, but I was worried for a lot of reasons about letting myself accept that and then acting on it, either publicly or privately. And one of my concerns, there were many, but one of them was, well, am I just going to be alone? Like, no one's going to want to date me, right? So that was scary. And then when I finally did come out and tell someone for the first time that I am indeed not cisgender, I didn't know what term I wanted to use at the time, but I was like, I'm not cisgender. My partner at the time informed me that she was allergic to trans women. Because her ex-partner had cheated on her with a trans woman. So that was my experience in my partnership when I first came out, right? And that was rough, right? And after that, it's been a journey trying to navigate and unpack and deconstruct and reconstruct and explore how these notions of sex and love and relationships and intimacy and even friendships relate as I'm transitioning, and they're kind of all transitioning alongside me. By them, I mean all of those concepts. Right? So there's this quote I'd like to offer you. This is from Gwendolyn Ann Smith. Now, you may have recently celebrated Trans Day of Remembrance, or at least observed Trans Day of Remembrance. If you don't know the name Gwendolyn Ann Smith, she is the person or one of the people who founded Trans Day of Remembrance. And this is from her essay, We're All Somebody's Freak. And the quote goes, "We live in a world of incredible variations, where there are some 200,000 species of moths and butterflies to be found in this planet, where one can find snowy ice caps and boiling cauldrons of lava, and where biodiversity is the very, oh, I forgot a letter, very thing that keeps the whole complex system in tune. The notion of classifying things and then claiming that only this or that is a proper version of some being is a distinctly human construct." Right? So we look at all this natural variation in nature, and if we were to point at one little sliver of it and be like, that's the right thing, that's a distinctly human construct. And here Smith casts this in terms of things, but we can also think of it in terms of practices. We have all these practices, all these ways of relating to one another, all these ways of relating to ourselves. There's huge variation in that. But if we were to look at one narrow sliver of it and say, that is the right way to do things, that's the right way to do gender, that's the right way to date, that's the right way to have sex, that is a distinctly human construct. Yeah. But it's one that a lot of us inherit very deeply when we're born, right? I'm sure many of you have struggled with a lot of these questions already, a lot of these pressures and norms. It's maybe why you're here, right? These familiar love stories that we get, right? So we grow up on love stories. We're fed them from the moment we can start understanding stories. We're bombarded with love stories. And those stories, they shape the way we think about love, sex, and relationships, and even gender. Right? When I was a little kid, I learned about justice from like watching Batman cartoons. Right? I learned about love, sex. Well, not sex, I guess. That came later. But I learned about things like love, relationships, gender from watching things like Disney movies. Right? These stories have a formative effect on us. Right? But those stories tend to have be based on a very narrow conception of what is actually possible. We look back at the old Disney movies that some of us might have grown up on, and we see the representation of relationships and romance. And it is such a tiny, tiny little bit of what is actually possible. And also, it's a tiny little bit that tends to uphold dominant power structures, right? We internalize this is the way it is, and usually that's serving someone's interests who aren't necessarily ours, right? There's patriarchal interest, there's capitalist interest, there's the interests of, cis heteropatriarchy, et cetera, right? Which, for many of us in the room, we might not fully align with. But no matter how much deconstruction we do throughout our lives, those stories got their hooks in very early, and it is very hard to sort of cleanse ourselves of their influence if we even fully want to. Right? But at some point, and here I'm going to use a metaphor that's been taken from us, and I want to take it back, right? You may be familiar with the so-called red pill, right? You see this a lot in sort of angry, young, right-leaning man communities, right, on various social media platforms, right? And the idea there is they take the red pill, it's a Matrix reference, and that wakes them up and they see through all the nonsense of feminism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what those folks tend to not realize is that the red pill comes from the Matrix, comes from the Wachowski sisters. It's estrogen, right? It was a metaphor for starting your transition, and it's a red pill because the pill, when the movie was coming out, was red, right? So forget about the Ben Shapiro style red pill. We can reclaim it. Thinking about all these stories, these love stories, these norms that we internalize, we might take our own red pill and start to see through the social pressures, the norms, expectations that push restrictive and sometimes exclusionary ideas of relationships onto us, right? We might feel these norms pushed onto us to the point where we feel like there's no place for us in arenas of love, intimacy, dating, relationships, right? But we can take our own red pill and start to see through that, start to see it as the nonsense that it is, right? But the scary thing is, once we start to see through that, that can open up a lot of possibilities. But that itself, the possibilities can be overwhelming. They can be uncomfortable, perhaps even scary, right? So the Matrix has a lot in common with Plato's allegory of the cave, where there was, these people in a cave and they were locked into place and there was someone casting shadows on a wall in front of them. And since that's all the folks ever saw, they thought those shadows were the real thing. But then one of the folks gets loose, climbs out, gets to the top of the cave and looks up and sees the sun for the first time. And it is overwhelming. It shorts out their eyes. They're like, I can't handle this. They want to go back down into the cave, right? When we start to see through these norms and realize, oh, wait, the world is much bigger. We can actually engage in many, many more things in this little sliver. That can be overwhelming. It can be like seeing the sun for the first time. Mm-hmm. But a thing to remember is that even though we inherit these love stories, we are ultimately the authors of our own lives. We get to write our own stories. So just as we are on journeys to self-actualize with respect to gender, we can also transition our own ideas of love, sex, and relationships into ideas that work better for us. Okay? And transition, maybe you've experienced this, it can destabilize our understanding of gender. Right? I have far less of an idea of what gender is now that I've been trans and even professionally trans, academically trans for years, right? It used to be easy when it was simple, but now it's complicated and it got hard, but it got fascinating, right? That destabilization of the concept has been really enriching. Right? So just as transition can destabilize our understanding, not just of gender and related things like sex, sexuality, it can also destabilize our understanding of love and of relationships. And that destabilization is an opportunity to really lean into exploration, which is really exciting, or can be, while also sometimes a little scary. So with that kind of on the table, I'd love to pose a question to y'all in the chat if you're comfortable answering. I want to know, to the extent that you're willing or able to share, in what ways has transition impacted your experience or perception of intimacy? I'll share while y'all are typing up answers. It's definitely experienced it, right? So, or it's definitely impacted it in my experience. So I'm on feminizing hormones. I take a lot of estrogen. My reception of intimacy now, and emotional intimacy in particular, feels so much more powerful than it did pre-transition in my experience. And also in terms of perception, my idea of intimacy has expanded so much. As I've queered my gender, I've also queered my idea of intimacy. Other folks sharing here, I see a couple of different answers here. So I need a lot more touch to feel fulfilled now. No longer want my genitals to be involved. Absolutely valid, right? It says transition has definitely opened up intimacy more for me. I've unlocked the ability to connect more deeply with others when I get better at connecting to myself. That is a fantastic point there. When we become more comfortable ourselves, when we're able to lean into self-acceptance, self-confidence, that changes the way we can relate to other folks. I see a friend sharing here, I need more intimacy. Oh, and I feel for you. I feel for you, friend. Yes. And it is there for you, and it is coming. See, another comment, it's now a whole lot more complicated. So much I haven't dated since transitioning. Yeah, it can get really complicated, especially with some of the impossible positions that trans folks are put into socially when it comes to dating, right? To the point where we might even just kind of give up on the whole enterprise. Right? Now, there's more coming in here than I can read all of, but I'll go through just a few more. I see this comment, I started transitioning last month and I suddenly wanted intimacy so much more than before. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a number of reasons for that, some of which biological, some of which psychological, some of which social. Yeah. You see this share, it feels like being trans makes everything much more intense in a good way. I haven't had the opportunity to be with anyone on my journey yet, but it feels like being with someone who's also trans. There will be so much of a deeper and more complex intimacy. Yeah, and we'll talk about those kinds of connection in a couple of slides. I love this point that shows up near the bottom of the chat right now, that transitioning destroyed the idea that sex is the epitome of intimacy. Yes, yes, if I could snap my fingers, I would, but I can't snap my fingers. But that's a huge point, right? One of those stories that we're told is that sex and intimacy are basically the same thing. We'll return to that in a minute, but it's much bigger than that. And even thinking about, I mean, for me, transition destroyed any idea I have of what sex even is in the first place, right? I'm a sexologist. I'm a sexuality counselor. If you ask me to try to tell you what sex is, I'm going to have a really hard time doing that in any short amount of time because it's a really, really, really complex, complicated topic, right? Not nearly as straightforward as many would have you believe. So I'm going to go ahead and move into the next section now, though y'all can keep the comments coming if you like. I want to briefly go through this topic of trans dating or dating while trans and just offer a couple of acknowledgments. So there's a quote here from Juno Dawson, right, saying, whether you're cis or trans, making a relationship work is, well, hard work. In the first instance, it's about finding someone you're totally comfortable with, someone you can really be yourself around. But when you're trans, being yourself takes considerably more work than it does for some. What's more, nothing in the media or culture is telling us we're desirable or lovable. So these stories that we have internalized from youth they don't just give us a narrow conception of love, but they give us one that tells us that we don't get it. Because what are trans people in media historically? We're serial killers, we're victims, we're butts of jokes. We're not love interests, right? We're not people who have happy love stories. We are in the actual world, but not in the stories that we see. And this idea that being ourselves takes so much work, I mean, it shouldn't, right? But the world makes it pretty hard for us to be ourselves. You may have heard the joke that for some of us, it might feel like our gender is behind a paywall, right? So when someone says, oh, do you just want to find someone that you can be yourself around? Well, I hope they have a lot of money to cover a lot of medical expenses so that I can be myself around them, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Right? All this is to say, being trans while dating and dating while trans, very difficult combination. Not impossible, but it has hurdles that not everyone else is going to experience. It might feel sometimes like there are impossible expectations, right? We face numerous negative stereotypes, right? And in addition to those negative stereotypes, we're also expected to be perfect. Our relationships and sexualities, especially for trans feminine people and trans women, our sexualities are scrutinized to a higher degree than cisgender people. Looked at under a microscope, people waiting for us to go wrong so they can start slinging accusations. And we also often face significant concerns regarding safety, right? And also pressures regarding disclosure, right? Where I've been in rooms with therapists who are insisting that a trans person must disclose that they are trans before entering into any kind of relationships, to which I say, take a seat, honey. No, that is the trans person's decision. They will disclose if and when they are comfortable. Right? But there's all of these conflicting expectations about how we show up, right? We are sexualized, but we are also completely desexualized, right? We are seen as, sometimes we are seen as predators, right? But we are also seen as victims, right? And all these expectations can make us feel like we are backed into a corner so that even stepping out into that world dating can be terrifying. Right? This comment in the chat, as soon as us being trans is known, it's like our genitals are public property. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had to sit with that one for a second. But this leads some folks to explore a dating philosophy or even a dating practice that some of you may know. It's this idea of going T for T, right? Because many of the stereotypes and pressures come from transphobia and from cis heteronormativity. And by cis heteronormativity, I just mean this intersection of cis normativity, this idea that being cisgender is the norm and anyone else, any other way of being, is defective, delusional, deviant. Right? And heteronormativity, which is the idea that you got to be heterosexual. Any other way of being is delusional, defective, deviant. Right? You put all those together and you get these impossible expectations. You get these stories of love that exclude us from them. And this leads some trans persons to go T for T, trans for trans, and date exclusively within the trans community. Right? Of course, though, it's worth noting that dating T for T doesn't guarantee that all those stereotypes and pressures will be 100% gone. Because we have all been raised in a cis heteronormative transphobic society. It can take a lifetime to unpack, deconstruct, or even recognize some of those things in us. Right? So dating someone simply because they're trans and assuming as a result that they must then be safe in these ways and not reproducing these impossible expectations or these stereotypes, that's a little tricky. Right? Because I think we can probably, at least all or most of us, think of some people in the trans community who we might still describe as transphobic or cis heteronormative in various ways. Right? I won't name any names, but T for T is an option. And it's understandable why some people go that way. Right? Bonding with someone who experiences a similar sort of struggle, who has an overlap to your lived experience, who has some insight into your identity. Right? Now, when we transition, right, transition can look so many different ways, right? But it can really change not just your body, not just your relation to yourself, but it can change your dating preferences. It can change who you want to date. Right? It is not uncommon for a trans person to have a shift in orientation or the demographic that they're interested in, or to find that expand or shift when they start going through a transition, even just a social transition. Sometimes letting yourself be confident in who you are, self-acceptance, also lets you start to recognize attraction for what it was, attraction that you might have pushed down or denied before, and realize, oh, I actually am attracted to those people. Right? I actually am attracted to men. I actually am attracted to women, etc., etc. But it can also change how you want to date. It can change why you want to date. And those questions of who you want to date, how you want to date, why you want to date, for some of us, when we transition, maybe we get immediate clarity. Or maybe it takes a long time to come to answers, if ever. The answers to those questions, who, how, why, they might seem elusive and confusing. And whether you get immediate clarity or whether you are still scratching your chin wondering, what kind of people do I want to date? How do I want to date? What does dating look like for me? Why do I want to date? Do I want to date? Right? Whether you're certain or uncertain, both absolutely okay. But sometimes finding your footing in these matters involves embracing that uncertainty and saying, yeah, I'm absolutely certain that the state that I'm in right now is one of uncertainty. And that's okay. That's absolutely okay. Dating while trans is complicated. We do ourselves a disservice when we insist that it is simple, because it's just not. Now, I'd like to open it up to another round of questions to you all. If you're open to sharing, what are some relationship struggles or, on the flip side, breakthroughs that you've experienced since starting your transition? Right? I mentioned earlier, my notion of what a relationship even is has greatly expanded since I started my transition, just like my notion of what a woman is, what a man is, has greatly expanded. And this has helped me enter into a bunch of new kinds of relationships that I didn't even know were possible before, right? So in your experience, what are some struggles or breakthroughs that you've experienced since you've started? Right? So realizing a lot of my attraction to men was gender envy. Oh yeah, yeah. I always thought bald femmes were super hot, and then I was like, oh, I get it now. I see a major struggle is feeling confident a love interest will care enough to connect with me on this path. Yeah, I relate to that. Mhm. I don't know how to express what it is that I really want in a relationship. Yeah, that's hard. Right? I find myself too femme for a gay man and too mass for bi guys, almost like we don't have a place in the dating pool. hmm Yeah, because traditional preferences don't always include slots for us, right? This question of do I want to date them or be them? hmm hmm See this one getting fetishized by cis people or having cis men punch down on my masculinity just to make themselves feel better about dating a man. Real, right? The fetishization, dealing with what are called chasers, people who fetishize trans people and want to date us, not just because they're open to dating trans people, but because they only, or they're particularly attracted to the trans element of trans people. That can be very, very, very difficult to navigate. I find a lot of that in my city, surprisingly, my little desert town that I live in. See this note, I'm way more attracted to men than I was pre-T. I don't feel the safest dating men due to my previous experiences, so I've been isolating more than like, yeah, these are real struggles. Yeah. Thank you all so much for sharing all of these, right? And thank you for being open with your experiences so we can really get to some deep stuff here. As we can see, there's a lot of different experiences being represented in the chat, a lot of different perspectives, right? Different struggles, different breakthroughs. So let's go ahead to the next section on redefining intimacy. Right? Because this is on trans love and intimacy. But what do we mean by intimacy? Right? So one of my favorite writing duos, and if you've been to any of my webinars before, you've probably seen me quote them, is Meg John Barker and Alex Yantafi. Fantastic. I recommend anything that they write individually or together. And they have this brief comment in their book, How to Understand Your Sexuality, a practical guide for exploring who you are. And they say intimacy is described in most dictionaries as a state of closeness and or familiarity. This closeness can be with another person or people, ourselves, or even a place, a history, and so on. I love this expansion to this idea of intimacy, to allow it to apply not just to other people, but to groups, to selves, to places. I might have an intimate connection with the land. To history, I might have an intimate connection with an event, etc. Intimacy seems to include a deep knowing and relating that shortens the distance between self and other. Right? So we might think of intimacy as a way of bringing close, of dissolving a barrier between. That shortens the distance between self and other, or even the distance we sometimes place between different parts of ourselves. So when we practice self-intimacy, it might be about eroding barriers, breaking down walls that keep us fragmented, keep us segmented, compartmentalized, and allowing us to experience the kind of beautiful mess of unity, right? Whether that's internally, or that also I think would apply as a description with other people when we're exploring interpersonal intimacy. Right? Now, earlier it was mentioned this idea that, intimacy is bigger than sex. Right. So the first step of redefining intimacy is to note that the word intimate is often you just use as a euphemism for sex. Like, oh, they were being intimate. And what we mean is they were having sex. Or we say, oh, that's intimate apparel. And what we mean is that's apparel for sexy time. Right? But using the word as just a euphemism for sex has this unfortunate consequence of erasing all of the other potential forms of intimacy and connection that are out there waiting to be explored. It also potentially leaves us with lots of areas of intimacy that go unidentified, and as a result are unfulfilled or underfulfilled. And what I want to introduce to you all now is this idea called the split attraction model. Now, this goes all the way back to German proto-sexologists to the late 1800s, traces itself back up to modern day, became popular with asexual activist David J., who founded AVEN, the Asexuality Visibility and Education Network, right? It's this way of thinking about attraction and then tying it back into this notion of intimacy, right? So a lot of times we think of attraction as like one lump sum, right? If you're attracted to someone, you're attracted to them in all the ways. And if you're attracted to them in some ways and not others, that can also sometimes be seen as a failure, right? Like if you're romantically attracted to someone, but you're not sexually attracted to to that same person, they might take offense to that, right? But according to the split attraction model, no, attraction can be split into many different species. Right? There's different kinds. There's sexual attraction. There's romantic attraction. There's platonic attraction. There's emotional, intellectual, spiritual, creative, political, aesthetic, and more. We can keep going. Right? And the idea is that these are all independently variable. For any given person, you might be attracted in some or all of these ways. You might be attracted in none of these ways. Right? I myself, in my own experience, when I relate to my partners, I don't experience sexual attraction toward them. I don't experience romantic attraction towards them. But I do experience emotional, intellectual, spiritual, creative, political, and aesthetic attraction toward them. And our relationships are founded on that. Right? There might be some people who I do find myself sexually attracted to, but not emotionally or intellectually attracted to. That's okay too. We mentioned earlier in a quote at the beginning that there's like 200,000 species of moths and butterflies. So I want you to think about butterflies for a second. Sometimes we talk about getting butterflies in our tummy when we're around someone we like because they kind of make us a little nervous. And on the typical way of looking at attraction, where it's just one thing, butterflies is butterflies. But what the split attraction model does is it reminds us that there are species. And when you train your eye, you can start to see the difference between the blue morpho and the monarch and the subspecies and the subspecies. And then you can really start to appreciate the different kinds and notice where they show up and understand the subtle differences in their behavior. Right? We get a much richer landscape and a much more varied landscape of attraction and the possibilities of attraction when we realize that these things can come apart, and it's not a problem when they do, right? So for the average untrained eye, butterflies is butterflies, but to the person who knows and has reflected and introspected through the lens of the split attraction model, we might feel around someone romantic butterflies or emotional butterflies, creative butterflies, aesthetic butterflies. Right? And then a question is, what would it be to explore different kinds of intimacy rooted in these different kinds of attraction? So often we think about sexual intimacy, and that's great. So often we think about romantic intimacy, but what about platonic intimacy? What is it to break down that barrier with you and your friends? What is intellectual intimacy? What is it to get close, to erode those distinctions between you and another person intellectually? What is creative intimacy? What is political intimacy, right? There's all sorts of answers here, and what I'm hoping is that this will get gears turning and you can start to think, what would that look like? How could I practice that? We might recognize among more of the people in our lives, oh, I'm attracted to a lot more people than I thought, because now I'm recognizing that there are these other butterflies. I'm really creatively attracted to this individual. That's a legitimate form of creativity. What does intimacy look like there? It's not sexual intimacy. It's not romantic. It's creative, but what does it look like? Right? Now, also earlier, this notion of sex was brought up, right? And when we talk about intimacy, we talk about sex, but sex is a really complicated topic. And when we spend just a few minutes thinking over the question of what is sex, we'll often realize that we have no idea, right? Coming up with an informative, short, sort of consistent definition of sex, yeah, good luck. But there is this very narrow social conception that tends to play into cis heteronormative patriarchal ideas. But the actual landscape of sexual connection can be much, much more expansive and customizable, right? So I'll say here that while it's not true that everything is sex, it is true that anything can be sex. And I'll share with y'all two personal anecdotes. I used to have a partner. We were partners. We were attracted to each other in many ways. We were not sexual or romantic, right? Our intimacy was through rope, right? That's how we connected physically. Right? There were no genitals. There was no exchange of fluids. It was just the rope. And there was a beautiful, beautiful energy exchange that was deeply fulfilling for both of us. Now, in their perspective, they called it sex. I didn't experience it as sex, but we talked about that. And I was fine with the fact that they saw it as sex because I knew what they meant by that. And they were fine that I didn't see it as sex because they knew what I meant by that. We were on the same page. We were just using our words differently. We were sharing the same experience and describing it in different ways. That was totally okay. I had another partner, right, who, again, we weren't sexual, but what played the sex role in our relationship was tattooing. I never felt more held, more safe, and more intimate than I was on their table getting tattooed by them. Right? So they have tattooed me from foot to face, right? You can't see a lot of them on the Zoom screen, but that was as intimate as any sexual encounter I could imagine, right? So it wasn't sex, but it wasn't not. It really depends on what you mean by that term. And if you yourself want to look at it through that lens, you might not. But either way, it played that role of intimacy. You might think that was a sort of creative, aesthetic intimacy that we were building there. Right? And you might think, what is your thing? What are different ways that you can do that? Is it co-authorship? Is it writing poetry with someone? Is it cooking meals with someone? Is it exercising with someone? Right? Is it sitting in a room on a bed, gazing into each other's eyes without touching? Right? Is it something like conventional sexual activity that just doesn't involve genitals? Right? Is it sexual activity that involves genitals in non-standard ways? Really, this is a choose your own adventure. No one gets to tell you from top down what sex has to be. You get to kind of invent that and negotiate that with your partner, and it's pretty broad. Right? So with all this talk of intimacy, I'd like to ask y'all, if you're comfortable sharing in the chat, what aspects of intimacy are most important for you, right? Do you need intellectual intimacy? Do you need sort of creative intimacy, romantic intimacy, emotional intimacy, even sexual intimacy, right? Or we might even think there's other kinds of physical intimacy other than sexual, like sensory, right? So like rope play for me was not sexual, but it was sensual and it was very sensory, right? So for you, what aspects are interesting for you? See an answer there, all of them, right? Or an I'm not sure. I love the I'm not sure answer, right? Spiritual, emotional, emotional, emotional. See a couple votes for intellectual intimacy. Right? Yeah. Oh, I love this one of musical intimacy. There is such a profound experience of playing music with someone and really like playing with them. Right? I have a partner now who I occasionally play music with. We don't have sex, but that playing music is such a powerful connection between us. It's unlike any sort of connection I have with others. So I love that one. Right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Seeing more on intellectual. Yeah, I love all of these answers. Right? And that one up top, I mostly just want to feel seen. You know, friend, I really relate to that. I recently realized, if I can share, one of my love languages is being drawn. And I realized that I never feel more held by someone than when they draw me, because I feel very, very seen. I feel witnessed. And then I am able to see myself as that person sees me, which is one of the most validating experiences. And in my experience, I realized this just not long ago, that experience of being seen by being drawn for me is far more intimate than any sexual encounter that I've had in my life. Right? Might be different for you, but it can be really, really powerful. Right? So we'll continue. We got two more little sections to go through. I want to talk about relationship styles. And here we're going to introduce some like big fancy words, but I think they'll help. Right? So just the other day was polyamory day. Right? And there's a lot to say about polyamory, a lot to say about non-monogamy, a lot to say about monogamy and all other sorts of relating. Right? So let's say some stuff about it. So here's another quote by Meg John Barker, because I just love them so much. So MJ writes, occasionally alternatives to monogamy, like swinging, open relationships, or polyamory, because those are all different, are covered in mainstream media. But usually in some kind of freak of the week format applied to deviant sexualities, much like trans people have been presented in the past. Right? And MJ continues, the possibility of more than one relationship as presented as the enclave of new age weirdos or of the ridiculously rich and famous. Now, Barker would never tell you you have to be non-monogamous, right? Anyone who said that, they would probably scoff at. But what they would suggest is, hey, we should stop demonizing and writing off other sort of relationship styles that are outside of the norms. We already exist outside of norms. We can perhaps be sympathetic to other people who exist outside of norms in other ways. So let's talk about some of those norms. Right? So earlier we mentioned this norm of cis heteronormativity. Right? And many of our default assumptions about how relationships and intimacy can be are rooted in cis heteronormativity. Right? And that tells us that the only acceptable intimate relationship style is between adults of the so-called opposite sex. You have to have a cis man dating a cis woman. They're only dating each other, period. Cis heteronormativity tells us that that is the default setting, the standard relationship, the ideal relationship. Anything outside of that is pushed to the margins. Anything outside of that is somehow defective, deviant, deficient. But cis heteronormativity has some very close cousins that are worth looking at. Right? Mononormativity. Right? So we can also examine how our default assumptions about relationships and intimacy can be rooted in what's called mononormativity, which centers monogamy in the same way that cis heteronormativity centers cisgender heterosexual relationships. And it tells us that the only acceptable intimate relationships are monogamous, that is, exclusive to one partner. Right? Now, just like we don't have to reject being cisgender or reject being heterosexual in order to reject cis heteronormativity, we also don't have to reject monogamy in order to reject mononormativity. Monogamy is the practice. Mononormativity is the rule that says that that practice must be practiced. Right? It's having monogamy forced on us rather than chosen by us. And that's really different. Right? But we see cis heteronormativity tells us our relationships have to be between people of the so-called opposite sex. Mononormativity tells us that they have to be exclusive. But then there's two other kinds that I want to put on your radar. One is called amadonormativity. That comes from the Italian word for beloved. So a lot of our assumptions about relationships and intimacy are rooted in amadonormativity, which tells us that the only acceptable intimate relationships are romantic. Long-term, following a path of conventional escalation. You have a meet cute, you date, then the order might get a little bit tricky after that, depending on your politics. Maybe you get married, then have sex. Maybe you have sex, then you get married. But either way, you do both. And then you have a kid, you buy a house together, you grow old together, you retire, you're best friends. That's this conventional pattern of escalation, right? So amadonormativity tells us that the only real or the ideal or the most important intimate relationships are romantic ones. And then there's what's called allonormativity, allo for the word meaning other, right? And this tells us that the only acceptable intimate relationships are sexual relationships, right? Whereas if you're in a relationship with someone that isn't sexual, it's not really intimate. It's somehow fake, or you're just friends, right? But when we look at all of these and we realize that they're all as much BS as any of the others, right? And that our relationships can look however we want them to without having to follow any rules that tells us that they have to be this way or that way, we open up so many more possibilities. Right? I have two relationships right now. One is with someone who I love dearly, long distance. We are absolute best friends. We are, in a sense, other than friends. We call ourselves clowns. We're not girlfriends. We're not partners. We've chosen the word clown to describe our relationship because it suits us and because no one knows what it means, which means it comes with no inherent script or baggage, right? There's no path that we are expected to follow. We get to make it up as we go. I have another person who I'm currently very, very connected with, who I love dearly. It's not a sexual relationship. It's not an exclusive relationship, but it's a relationship. It's very real. We're bugs. We pick that term to describe ourselves. And again, no one knows what it means, but we do. Right? So we're not girlfriends. We're not partners. We're bugs. That comes with no script. That comes with no expectation. Maybe that practice of coming up with unique individual names to honor and frame your very important relationships will work for you. If it does, run with it. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. Right? But all of these relationships are ones that can exist outside of these frameworks, or perhaps more strikingly, can't exist, can't even be spoken about coherently in cis heteronormative, mononormative, amadonormative, allonormative frameworks. Too many syllables there. But I'd love to hear from you all in the chat. What relationship styles feel most comfortable and affirming for you? Right? What works for you in terms of relationship style, or what are you interested in exploring? Right? So I mentioned earlier, I'm a relationship anarchist. I like to meet a person and then we just let that connection grow into whatever best suits the two of us, right? With conscious negotiation of consent and consent as we go, without trying to force romance or sexuality or any other kind of connection, etc., etc. That's my preferred practice. What works for you all? My nesting partner and I are boodles. That's very cute. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so building friendship first. I see a mention of queer platonic relationships there. So for any of y'all who don't know the term queer platonic, a queer platonic relationship is one that queers the romantic platonic divide and kind of exists as both or neither or beyond that distinction. They're very customizable, and all the relationships I've described from my own life so far, I would put under that term queer platonic, right? So if any of y'all are interested in that, can definitely look it up further. These are relationships that, again, kind of complicate this distinction between the romantic and the platonic and allow you to kind of play in between. Right? Mm-hmm. I see this comment. I'm open to exploring almost anything if it's done respectfully. I'm in a mono relationship at the moment, but we aren't locked into that. It's just how we started with only a few variations from that. Yeah, so a word that some of you all might know or might just be learning now is if you're in some relationships, you practice monogamy, and in other relationships, you're open to non-monogamy. Some people use the term ambiamorous for that, to say that it kind of shifts depending on the relationship. Some relationships are non-monogamous, some are monogamous. Mm-hmm. 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 And yeah, I see this comment here. I don't know what works for me. I've only seen what doesn't. I have to explore this the same way I'm exploring being trans. Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of it, frustratingly, is trial and error. But you can learn so much so that those errors aren't really losses, they're lessons. So it's like trial and lesson. It's refining. It's all forward movement. Right? So we got one more section to go through, and then we'll wind down and do a quick Q&A. And this is just on building the connections that you want. So there's this quote by Juno Roche that I read earlier today, and it really hit me, so I wanted to put it in here, right? So this comes at the end of a book that Juno Roche did, edited on, it was a bunch of interviews on queer sex, right? And she writes, I still feel lonely. I desperately want to cuddle and a kiss to reignite the blue flickering flame of life. But I truly do feel like I am ready to just go out and start taking the chance on being open, vulnerable, and fragile in the idea of others. I know from this process that there are many others out there, just like me, trying to navigate these spaces. Navigate these spaces we have and spaces we can create. And that last line hits me so hard. These spaces that we can create. Because just like we have built trans spaces, we can build spaces for the relationships, for the loves, for the intimacies that we want, right? For the ones that we need, for the ones that we find ourselves practicing but don't have the language for yet, we can make up language for it. That's what I do with my clown and with my bug. We didn't have a label that described what we did, so we made one up, right? Lots of power in this quote. I feel it. Maybe you feel it too. But here are just some thoughts about moving forward. Remember, intention, not expectation. So it's absolutely okay to value and seek any kind of relationship, even if it is the kind pushed on us by dominant society. Some people might explore their gender and come out thinking, yeah, I am cisgender. I love that. That's really cool because now it's chosen rather than inherited. Same thing with relationships. Maybe you want a romantic, sexual, vanilla, exclusive relationship. That's amazing. But when we think about it and reflect on it, then it becomes chosen rather than sort of us just doing it because we're expected to. There's a big difference between wanting it because you are expected to and wanting it because upon reflection you genuinely want it. But then the next hurdle that comes up once we start thinking about what we want is this unfortunately common hurdle of not feeling like we're worthy of what we want. Right? And that feeling of not feeling worthy, right, is a form of imposter syndrome. It's a form of imposter syndrome with respect to worth rather than competence, right? Where we feel like an imposter even thinking that we're worthy of the kind of love that we actually want. But you can absolutely give yourself permission to breathe that one out, right? Imposter syndrome is a liar. And a thing to remember is that one kind of person who consistently never feels imposter syndrome is a genuine imposter. So if you're feeling it, pretty good evidence that you're not one, right? You are worthy of exactly what it is that you want to find. But then the next step is put yourself out there. Put yourself out there in the way that you want to be received. And that goes even if you're already in a relationship and you're not looking for any new ones, reflecting on how you put yourself out there in your current relationship can be a very healthy and fruitful practice. Showing up more as you in your current dynamic, trying to negotiate, work with your partner to evolve the dynamic. It's called a dynamic, right? Because they're dynamic. They can shift, right? They can change. They're living. They're not static, right? To grow it into something that maybe suits the you now more than the you 5 years ago that got into it, 10 years ago that got into it. You can treat your relationship as a living document. So just a couple more moments here. I'll invite y'all to, again, share in the chat. In terms of building intimate connections, what scares you? What empowers you, right? So there's two sides, two aspects of that question. What scares you with this thought of putting yourself out there? And what empowers you putting yourself out there? Being scared of more wounds on the heart, right? Trauma, that word means wound, right? I feel that. Scared of getting old and losing my femininity, not being able to age with grace. Oh, goodness, friend. Oh, that aches in my heart. I feel that, right? See, intimacy scares me. Rejection of who I am scares me. Rejection, right? I see reject four things, four like nods toward rejection here. Let me ask y'all, what empowers you? What helps you find the strength to put yourself out there? Right? I'll say for me, it has been some of the connections I have found, some of the ones that I have built who have shown me that things are possible beyond what I was ever told were possible. Right? And knowing that is enough to really, really keep me going on some days. Knowing that relationships can be built rather than having to be discovered or found or waiting for them to come to you. I hold on to the idea that being better for myself means being better for others. The two well-beings are intertwined. Absolutely. Sometimes you meet someone and get to know them and you just resonate on levels you never knew. Yes. Right. Yeah. I really appreciate all of these shares. I'm going to wind this down now, open it up for some questions, and then we'll have the after party where we can chat a little bit more face to face. Right. So what did we do here? We talked about love, sex, and transition. We talked about trans dating / dating while trans, explored this idea of redefining intimacy, explored some relationship styles, and reflected for a few moments on this idea of building the connections that we want. I want to close with this quote by a cartoonist, friend of mine, Sophie LaBelle, who's the author of the Assigned Male webcomic. Always keep looking for authentic ways to belong. Find the people who celebrate and uplift every aspect of your beautiful self. You're worth it. This is absolutely true. And those people are out there and they're waiting for you, right? You may not have met them yet, but they are out there. Right? And they're waiting to meet you. Right? And remember, again, as she says there, you are worth it, and any inner voice that tells you otherwise is a liar. Now, here's some recommended reading. They're the things that I shared. Also, some other stuff that I did not get into, which you can take a screenshot of this if you want to reference it, or it'll be sent around in the resources in the follow-up email.